So as has already been mentioned, we're speaking in this panel about combating the indigenous culture of violence and impunity. I think before we get into that, we need to understand what are we talking about when we talk about violence and when we talk about impunity. So first of all, what does violence look like in the case of Egypt today? There's no question that there's been a dramatic increase in religiously motivated violence in Egypt over the past few years. In 2017 alone, we've seen several major attacks, from the attack on buses of worshippers in Minya last month that killed and injured over 50 people, to the Palm Sunday bombings that killed 45 and injured 130, to the series of attacks in Sinai in February that forced many Christians to flee their homes. Violence has become more frequent, it's become more brazen, and it's become more difficult to stop, as ISIS has publicly stated its desire to target Egyptian Christians. And what does impunity look like? At the most basic level, there are no real consequences for the actions I just described. The perpetrators of religiously motivated crimes are often not brought to justice in Egypt. This feeds the narrative that one can get away with committing attacks on Christians and houses of worship scot-free. But let me point to some other less obvious examples of impunity. And the first I would point to are the reconciliation sessions that are often used in lower-level crimes, such as arson or vandalism. These are outside of the legal process and lack enforcement authority. These also keeps crimes out of the public eye, which not only harms the victims and their families, but also harms communities in that you do not provide a sense of justice and a sense of closure to these events. A second example of impunity is the constant state of emergency, which is a frequent tool used by the regime. After the attack just a few weeks ago, for example, President Sisi declared yet another state of emergency for 3 months. This has dangerous implications for human rights and civil liberties. It gives the government blanket power to go after the, quote, bad guys, but in reality, this tends to include crackdowns on political opponents and activists of the regime. States of emergency also have negative psychological consequences, putting the entire population on a state of hyper alert, which can also contribute to greater levels of violence. And then finally, I want to point to Sisi's rhetoric itself as a form of impunity. There are two issues here. The first is that while President Sisi has been usually very quick and forceful in condemning attacks, these condemnations are neither sincere nor backed up with any teeth, rendering them meaningless. Second, conversely, the unity mantra that he espouses fails to recognize the real threat that minorities face, which makes it easier to ignore the real and growing threat of violence against Christians in Egypt. So how should we combat, or how, not we, unfortunately, but how should this be combated? First of all, I would just note that impunity itself breeds violence. So to have any success in stopping violence, you need to stop impunity. Now first, let me describe the role of the government. And I think there's a real and serious question in whether or not the Egyptian government can actually stop the violence. I think they can certainly do more to address impunity, but I'm not sure that the Egyptian government at this time and the security services are equipped or trained to overcome the ISIS threat in particular. The Egyptian military and the police forces are woefully undertrained. They're equipped to fight an external threat, a holdover from the 1960s and 70s when Egypt was at war regularly with Israel. They're not at all prepared to fight the current ISIS threat and other terrorist elements in the Sinai. But another contributor to this rise in violence is the economic situation. We've seen a steady decline in Egypt's economy since the revolution. This breeds despair and frustration, which are both major contributors to extremism. And I think we need to remember that many of the ISIS recruits are not drawn to ISIS because of religious fanaticism, but rather because of frustration with the economy and with their own government's handling of the situation. And we see economic and social injustice has a direct impact on people's lives, which again feeds right into extremist recruitment pipelines. So the government should take seriously the need to improve Egypt's economic performance and ensure equitable distribution of wealth to counter the extremist recruitment. There's also a role for civil society to play. Unfortunately, civil society has been severely hampered by President Sisi's efforts to crack down on all forms of civic activism in the country. The latest example of the NGO law, which not only makes it virtually impossible for organizations to receive foreign funding, but also makes it clear that any organization that criticizes the state will be shut down or thrown in jail. That being said, there is still room for civil society, for church groups, for like-minded groups, to speak out loudly and to band together. One of the only ways, and I'm still very pessimistic about civil society's ability given the government's clampdown, but one of the only ways to overcome some of these issues is for groups to band together, for groups to network, come together, and fight the threat as one voice. Then finally, a role for the international community. since we're sitting in the Capitol in Washington, I think we need to discuss this very briefly. The international community has generally been very good about loudly condemning violence, but it needs to do more. Much like Sisi's statements, if there are no teeth, it would be unlikely to have a strong impact. And specifically speaking about the United States, I think there are lots of opportunities for engagement given the strong and growing relationship between the Trump administration and the Egyptian government. I would encourage members of Congress on their many, many visits to Egypt to raise this issue with President Sisi. They should visit churches. They should meet with church leaders. They should take pictures, share those pictures with the Egyptian press, share them with the American press, make sure this issue gets highlighted as part of regular visits. And I'd also encourage President Trump, who has developed a close relationship with Sisi, to make it crystal clear that Egypt must do more to address this problem. This can be done in private. There doesn't need to be necessarily a big public show, which I'm not sure would be effective. But it should be clear in the conversations that Trump has with Sisi that Egypt will not maintain its special relationship if it allows perpetrators of religiously motivated violence to go free. And then finally, I think the US government can do a much better job of targeting its military assistance to deal with the terror threat in Sinai to help root out ISIS